Hey folks, this is Evan from Bigger Britches, and I'm here today to record a video on recreating the devastation of your childhood, which is a sentence I read in Stephen Franson's book, Peaceful Parenting, which has been a really good read so far, and I highly recommend it if you're into peaceful parenting or just want to get an idea of what that even means. It's a great start. But he wrote this sentence in the book talking about how people have a need to recreate the emotional devastation of their childhood, which really struck me, and I wanted to dig into that deeper. Now, what does it mean to recreate the devastation of your childhood? Well, it means precisely what it says it means. I mean, you do everything in your ability to make your adult life as wretched and as traumatizing and as stuck as your childhood was. You know, for instance, I was thinking about, with me personally, when I was a kid, I had a really bad sugar addiction. And this sugar addiction came because I was very emotionally neglected, and I sought the sweet, instant dopamine hit of the sugary treats, of cookies and brownies and cakes and soda and all this different stuff. For me, it was a dopamine substitute to fill the void left by my parents. I was not getting pleasure from them. I was not getting attention and love. So I wanted a substitute, and the sugar was that substitute. Now, that was part of my emotional devastation as a child, was being emotionally neglected, not being shown attention. And as a kid, I resorted to sugar to fill that void. And I would say I did continue that devastation as an adult for my first year or so of being an adult. I'm 20 years old, so I'm quite young. And I've been off sugar for the last year or 2 years maybe. But I would say up until around age 18 or 19, I was eating a lot of sugar. It was a consistent habit of mine to eat sugar every night. And it was an unhealthy amount. It really was. And it was unhealthy. It was bad for me, bad for my skin. I've always kind of suffered with acne, and the sugar definitely made that worse. Bad for my gut health. I have a bad gut biome, and that's been something I've been rebuilding for the last year or so. And I kicked that addiction. And in kicking that addiction, I managed to, mourn that part of my childhood. And it took a lot of mourning of my childhood in order to kick that addiction. But let's say I hadn't mourned my childhood. Let's say that I kept eating sugar, that I kept using it as a crutch to cope with my bad history. That would have been an example of me recreating the devastation of my childhood. Addictions as a whole are just recreations of the devastation. It's someone who's living in a state of emotional coping forever, someone who's stuck in their old childhood feelings and aren't consciously thinking about it. They aren't consciously working through and mourning and processing their feelings as a kid, but they do subconsciously let it affect their everyday life. And in being a subconscious influence on their everyday life, it drives them to self-destruct and self-sabotage in a lot of ways, which, in that sense is like recreating the devastation of your childhood. I was thinking about people who are obese, people who were fat kids. And, fat children, that's not a healthy, normal thing. Every time there's a fat child, there's a failure on the part of the parent. They did not monitor the kid's, calorie intake. They didn't encourage the kid to play outside. They clearly didn't engage in sports with the kid. That's a very healthy, normal thing, I imagine, for a parent to, go outside with the kid. They take walks together. Maybe they throw a ball together. They go biking together. They do something. But if there's a fat child, then clearly the parent did not fulfill that responsibility of keeping their child healthy. And so I think a lot of fat kids will go on to become fat adults because they don't partake in the mourning process. They don't process the old feelings of, anger. I think there's a lot of anger in fat people. They're angry, I'm sure, at their parents for allowing them to get so unhealthy in the first place, for allowing them to be so obese and allow them to, in a lot of ways, kind of destroy their own body. I think a lot of fat people have that anger towards their parents, but they don't act it out towards their parents. They internalize a lot of it. And instead of processing those feelings and letting the anger have its day, they hold it in and they recreate their childhood by staying fat forever, by overeating forever. And when people do this, when people continue the trends that their parents started for them, it makes it a lot easier to defend your parents. It makes it a lot easier to not criticize your parents, which nobody wants to do. Nobody wants to go through that uncomfortable process of confronting their parents and, questioning, why did you fail me in this way and that way? Why did you neglect me? Why did you not, monitor me? For fat people, they'd say, why'd you let me get fat? For a lot of us internet kids, we'd say, why did you throw me in front of the computer and let that raise me? Why didn't you teach me morals? Like, why didn't you take the reins and guide me and steer me as a parent should? A lot of people don't confront their parents. They don't want to. It's very uncomfortable. And so what they'd rather do is find reasons to excuse their parents' behavior or find ways to bend and twist reality to make their parents look all the better, to make them look innocent. And probably the best way of doing this is recreating the devastation of your childhood. You self-sabotage. You continue the trends they set for you. If your parents set you up to be an addict, rather than getting angry, using your healthy anger and directing it towards them and saying, why did you give me these things when I was a kid? Why did you set me up for addiction? Why did you try to sabotage me? Instead of letting those emotions have their day in the sun, people would rather continue on the path that their parents, paved for them. Because that's not threatening to the family system. It's not threatening to their parents. And it doesn't come with uncomfortable confrontation. It's a very comfortable, slow descent into hell, which I think a lot of people are in. When they don't confront their parents, they're just in a slow descent towards self-destruction. And, I could certainly see that having been myself in a lot of ways. I mentioned my sugar addiction. If I hadn't coped with old feelings of abandonment and a need for pleasure and a need for happiness, if I hadn't coped with those emotions and I hadn't processed them, I probably would still be eating sugar. I'd still be using it as this addiction, this substitute for something I was missing. And I wouldn't be consciously aware of what it was that I was trying to replace. I would just know that this is replacing something. And I'd be living in a daze, a subconscious daze where I'm influenced by things that I haven't brought to the surface. There's these shadow actors. I think people have a lot of, these shadow actors in their hearts and their minds, which is really their parents. And it's old wounds, it's old traumas, and it just pulls the strings on you like a puppet. And people don't want to look up and see the puppet master. They would rather let the strings have its way with them. And it is certainly more comfortable that way. You get to avoid a lot of grueling pain, a lot of very uncomfortable feelings. Honestly, a trek through hell, something close to hell. That's kind of what it feels like to process the childhood anger, the sadness, the bitterment, the resentment. And there's a lot of ways people will try to avoid that. And, along with the recreation of their childhood devastation, they abandon ideals. They stop weighing themselves and others against ideal standards, against like a higher standard. And instead they make excuses. All of a sudden there's no such thing as good parenting or ideal parenting. All of a sudden it's a gray area. You can say, oh, they had a bad childhood. Your parents can say, oh, well, I wasn't perfect, but I did pretty good. And perfection is not a standard anyone asks for, but it's, just honesty. And, when you make mistakes, fess up to it. Don't be violent towards your children. Like, spend time with them be curious. I don't feel like the standard for good, peaceful parenting is like that high. But nonetheless, it's a standard that a lot of parents fail to live up to. And rather than enforce the standards on their own parents, like the children of bad parents will instead abandon standards. They will abandon ideals, and they'll become just these morally gray excuse machines who excuse themselves and others. And it's just sad to me to imagine living that way. Excuse me. Because as humans, like, we have that unique capability to be something more, than just violent, selfish animals. We have that capacity to be rational, to be peaceful, to be curious and loving. We're not animals. And I just think it's really selling ourselves short to act like we can't do better. And so that's why I get kind of sad when people make every excuse in the world for their parents, because it's like, come on, don't we want to strive for something more? Don't we? And I guess that was part of my problem with my family of origin was somewhere inside of me, I did want to strive for something more. I wasn't content with abandoning ideals and making excuses and brushing things under the rug. Like, I wanted justice and restitution, and I wanted there to be a path upward, a path towards something better. And that's not something my parents wanted. They wanted to be excused and absolved of everything. And some people would say it's the job of the child to absolve their parents, to forgive them, to wipe the slate clean and let their parents off the hook every single time. But to me, that's just insulting to the child and to the parents. It's insulting to pretend like your parents don't know any better or that they couldn't do any better, because everyone can do better. Every human has that unique potential, unique from animals, to be moral, to be righteous. And to pretend like parents are ignorant to this or they don't have the ability to be better, it's just kind of insulting. When people misconstrue that as loving, I think, pretending like children forgiving their parents for everything ever and not confronting them on important matters, on old wounds, and letting them get away scot-free with everything they've done wrong to their children. In doing that, I don't think the kids are being loving towards their parents. I think it's kind of insulting, actually. It's the ironic part. I think it's way more respectful to hold your parents to a standard and to say, if you're not going to meet these standards, then I guess it's over. If you're not going to be honest, if you're not going to be apologetic, if you're not going to be rational, if you're not going to be loving at the end of the day, then it's over. That's far more respectful of their intellect and their, God-given mind. So I feel like I'm rambling. Let me get back to the point. I think there was one more example of recreating childhood devastation that I thought was interesting. And it was in the case of my father, who, when he was 14, his own father died of a heart attack. And, this was very tragic, very traumatic. It's not something my father really got into all too often, but, on occasion he would get drunk and he would cry about it. And it came out in one way or another. It was very tragic, of course, as you can imagine. But because of this, my father was not parented, but he was not fathered from age 14 onward. So there was a big void, a gap in his most formative years where he was not guided by a male role model. So there was a lot of questions he had to answer for himself, a lot of steps along the way that he had to, take all by himself. And that's very hard. And, I have always had some empathy for that. But at the same time, my father lost a lot of my empathy when he decided to recreate that tragedy, that devastation onto me. When he became a father And he did not parent me through my most formative years. When my, around 14, the teenage years, the years where a boy is becoming a man, he's making that vital leap and needs a male role model to guide him along the way, to help him up that mountain. My father exited the building, metaphorically speaking. He still lived at home. He was there the whole time, but he just didn't parent me. He didn't teach me masculinity. And for him, that was very comfortable because he had not processed his own sadness and devastation from his own childhood, from the own lack of father figure when he was a teenager. He had not processed those complicated feelings, and he did not want to process them. And if he had fathered me in the way that he had never been fathered, that would have been healing. Most certainly that would have been healing, but that healing would have come with a lot of complicated old wounds. A lot of buried emotions would have come back up for him if he had done for me what had never been done for him. And out of a selfish desire for his own comfort, he decided to sacrifice me for the sake of his own comfort, in order to avoid those uncomfortable feelings. And so he made a selfish choice to choose himself and his comforts over my development, over my well-being. For him, that was a recreation of the devastation of his own childhood. He did unto me what was done to him. And isn't this the story of life of most families, a lot of families at least, is the parents don't mourn their own unfortunate experiences and they pass it down to their children, and then the children inherit all the screwed up dynamics of the parents, and then we keep tossing it down over and over again. It goes tumbling down the staircase like a slinky, and nobody thinks to stop it. Nobody thinks to question things along the way. This is just kind of the story of a lot of families. Certainly it was the story of mine. And all this is to say that, I'm sure, in the moment, in those years, my father was a lot more comfortable momentarily with not parenting me, and in that way avoiding the uncomfortable emotions that he had. He stored all these feelings of abandonment, of neglect, and I'm sure it was comfortable, but at the same time, I'm pretty sure it killed him a little bit more. There's a kind of violence in that. There's a kind of violence in doing unto your children what was done to you. And it's even worse because he was not ignorant to how it felt. He wasn't ignorant to how it felt to be fatherless. He knew exactly how that felt and how painful it was, and yet he did it to me anyway. And so when you think about it that way, that's when I start to lose some of my empathy for him. Because, there's really no excuse to do to others what was done to yourself. Yeah, I guess it's also a thing where it's like my dad, if he had held on to ideals of a perfect model example of what a father should be, if he had held that in his mind and strived for an ideal fatherhood, if he had strived for that, it would have been a different story. But my father had to give up on ideals in order to cope with his own childhood, because a bad childhood only is bad or seems bad if you compare it to the ideal, which I think we all do naturally as humans. This is what separates us from animals, is we get to conceptualize ideals, that there's something more than just the momentary carnal pleasure. Animals can't do this, but humans can. We can compare our animal nature to something more divine, something godly. We have that godly capability. And but that can be very uncomfortable. That can be very inconvenient to go against your animal self, your subconscious automatic self, and to strive for something better, especially if what you were given was not ideal. And my father was not given an ideal. And it would have been extremely commendable. It would have been really something special if he had given me the ideal childhood, in spite of the fact that he had not been given that. That would have been quite something. And some people do that, and it's beautiful. It's wonderful. Although very difficult, I imagine. Very difficult. And I won't pretend that that's going to be an easy thing for anyone. But, it's really unfortunate. And it's tragic at the end of the day. It's just tragic when people give up on ideals in order to cope with their own childhood. To make their childhood look all the better, or not quite so bad. They convince themselves that there is no such thing as an ideal, that there's just a big gray area, that, all behaviors are excusable. All your wrongs are permissible because, hey, someone did it to you before, so now you get to do it to someone else. I don't subscribe to that, though, and I've never have, and it was the reason why I couldn't fit in with my family. And, I hope and pray that it'll be the thing that keeps me moving forward, keeps me healing, hopefully helps me to be a better person, because Lord knows there are things I could work on more, like pride, humility, patience, things like this, things that require some prayer and some real commitment to work on. Some old demons from my own parents, things I inherited from them that I need to work out. But certainly I strive for an ideal. At least I have the ideal in my head. I have a picture of what's right, of what's correct, what's the best. And nobody's perfect, but I think it's the job of humans to use this unique consciousness of ours, something that nothing else in the animal kingdom has. It's our job to use this consciousness that was God-given to strive for an ideal. And so that's what I am trying to do a little bit more every day. And it's why I have a lot of respect for parents who are peaceful and who are loving towards their children. Even if they didn't have that exactly when they were kids, if they can strive for the ideal and give to their kids what they never had, that's a wonderful thing. And I think God smiles upon that kind of commitment. But I think that's going to about do it for this video on emotional devastation and recreating the traumas of your childhood. And I hope this was helpful. I think it was pretty interesting. I was excited to get this out to you guys, so hopefully someone watches this and finds it insightful. But in any case, thank you for watching. Hope you have a very good day. Hope the start of your new year has been good. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Please like, comment, and subscribe as well. Certainly comment if you have something to add to the conversation here. I'm going to get out of here. Peace out, and have a good day.